Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Turkey's parliament has approved a bill to deploy troops to Libya. The move is meant to support the embattled government of national accord, which is recognized by the United Nations. Every significant opposition party in the Turkish parliament has voted against the move. The legislation passed with a 325 to 184 vote. So far, the government has not revealed details about the possible deployment, but the motion allows the government to decide on the scope, amount, and timing of any mission. Meanwhile, following the announcement, US President Donald Trump spoke with President Erdogan and warned against any interference in Libya. The communication was confirmed by White House spokesman Hogan Gidley. GNA Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj and President Erdogan signed two agreements last November relating to maritime border demarcation and enhanced security cooperation. The GNA government is under pressure from Khalifa Haftar's forces. What exactly does Turkey intend to achieve through this move is what we shall discuss with our panel today. And we've got Dr. Mark Meirowitz, who teaches at the State University of New York Maritime College. We also have with us Guy Burton, who's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, Middle East Center, and also an adjunct professor of international relations. Thank you to both gentlemen. Let me begin with Dr. Meirowitz here. Dr. Meirowitz, what exactly is going on here?
This is really much about the maritime issue more than anything else. And Turkey has become isolated in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's why it entered into the Memorandum of Understanding with the Government of National Accord. The separate part about the military, and hopefully it doesn't come to that. You see Trump's point about it, and that would have a ricochet effect if the Turks come into Libya. That have an effect on Syria, because on the U.S. policy towards Turkey regarding Syria and sanctions and so forth. The problem with the maritime issue is that Greece and Israel, Egypt, and the Republic of Cyprus, in essence, have isolated Turkey from the ability, at least, or the intention of keeping Turkey from being able to exploit the resources in the area, but more importantly, the kind of legal no man's zone, where no law zone, where we have all these resources in the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus, and it's kind of, as I say, no, and then no one. And the problem is that the Turkish Cypriots are not being allowed to share in those resources. So Turkey is intervening. So again, Turkey has been isolated, and it's trying to assert itself to make sure that it is not kept out of the picture in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean. I think it's more about maritime than about becoming involved in a no-win problematic military conflict.
So are you saying that if deployment comes, it will not be ground deployment, that it'll be a naval deployment?
What I'm saying is that the motivation behind the Turkish effort to make the point that they want to intervene is really all about making sure that the government of national accord remains in power, because if the GNA remains in power, then the memorandum on the delimitation of the boundaries will remain in effect. If the government, the GNA, falls and General Haftar takes power, then that accord will fall away. The accord is essential to Turkey in terms of its maritime, the maritime boundaries and the ability to exploit the resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't think Turkey wants to become involved in another land war, but it wants to preserve its rights and also the rights of the Turkish Cypriots in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's kind of interconnected. And I certainly don't think it wants to be involved in another conflict like Syria. I don't think so.
Okay. Now, it's one to be at the drawing board and, pass a resolution in Parliament and talk about some kind of deployment. It's quite another when you have boots on the ground. And obviously, if you want to secure the GNA, then you have to deal with Khalifa Haftar. And Khalifa Haftar doesn't seem to be in any mood of relenting as far as putting pressure on the GNA is concerned. So we're essentially looking at some kind of conflict. And when we talk about conflict, then there's always the prospect of getting bogged down in that. So you think that that could be a possibility in terms of the Turkish forces getting embroiled?
Well, I mean, we didn't mention the Russia factor, which is the key factor in Syria as well. There are Russian mercenaries in Libya, and that is a really serious issue for Turkey becoming, you say, bogged down in this. Yeah, Turkey could go into Libya, but it would become stuck in Libya as it is in Syria. And I don't think they want to do it, particularly, as I said again, because the Russians are involved in Libya, and the relationship between Turkey and Russia is very important in terms of Syria. So these are all interconnected. So this is kind of a chess game. It's very complicated. And I think Turkey's making this move. I think in terms of the parliament, I think that as you show on your screen, the bill was approved 325 to, I think, 185. So there was a strong opposition in the Turkish parliament. Admittedly, the majority party has the power to pass the law, but I don't know that on the domestic side that Turkey really, even when the government wants to get involved in this, they want to put pressure on the on the ability of the GNA to stay in power. And that's a complicated chess game. But I think that I don't think they want to get involved, and they could get bogged down. But of course, the Turks could move in and be decisive. But I don't think they want to come into conflict with the Russian forces or Russian mercenaries. That could be very risky. Syria, we saw a similar scenario.
That would be very risky. And yeah, you're right, because I mentioned all the major opposition parties in the Turkish parliament voted against this motion. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Mark Meirowitz speaking with us. Let me hop over to Guy Burton here. Guy, explain for our viewers the various actors involved. As Mark was saying, this is a sort of complicated chess game. Unravel a little this complexity for the viewers.
I would probably agree with what Mark was saying, that if we look specifically at the vote yesterday, it's very much a case of sort of Turkey wanting to send a message and probably not wanting to be bogged down directly in the conflict itself. But then you've got to sort of look at the wider picture. And for the last 8 years or so, at least since the 2011 uprising and the subsequent civil war, we have had in Libya a situation in which there has been no organized central authority, that the country has effectively broken down. And while there are a number of different conflicting actors, the two main ones are primarily sort of the UN-backed Government of National Unity in Tripoli, and also the Haftar, General Haftar over in the east of the country. But also, more importantly, both sides are backed by proxies. Or rather, the conflict is one that is a proxy one for other regional actors. So you have on the Tripoli side, the Turks have been sort of supporting Tripoli, but also the Qataris as well. And on Haftar's side, he's been backed very much by the Egypt. And so for that, you have this conflict that's taking place. It goes beyond Libya itself. And so in some respects, yes, we can see sort of the recent Turkish decision as a way to, push back against Haftar, preferably indirectly, but also on a more regional scale, sort of the rivalry that's taking place.
So once again, so there are two levels of analysis here, and I think you've explained them very nicely. That there is the internal sort of fault lines, Libya, and then the proxies essentially take their cue from the broader chess game that is being played out in the greater Middle East in terms of both the realpolitik and the Machtpolitik. Is that sense correct?
Yes, but I would hesitate to say that Haftar and Tripoli are pawns of these actors. Obviously, they have their own certain degree of autonomy and agency, and certainly to some degree, for example, Haftar, when he started his offensive on Tripoli last April, it was very much sort of almost against what the Russians were hoping for. I mean, the Russians have been sort of making great play and trying to advance their influence within the country, and were taken aback a little bit by Haftar's attempt to make that move. So you have to see that these actors are actually acting on their own terms. They will also use their allies elsewhere to their own advantage, just as these outside actors are trying to use the Libyan conflict for their own ends as well.
So, Guy, one of the things that we have seen historically in such conflicts is, of course, how the funding comes in, how arms and ammunition comes in. Now, since GNA is recognized by the United Nations, have there been any efforts by the UN to actually try and sort of, ask the member states, those member states that might be, let's say, in this case, supporting Haftar, to ensure that he doesn't get the kind of wherewithal with which to continue the civil war?
Well, yes, I mean, there is really an arms embargo on Libya already. And I mean, that's pretty much been in place since the uprising back in 2011. But it's very much the case that, the different parties have all sort of pretty much disregarded it. And the United Nations itself has published a report in the last year or so, which has identified a number of different actors on both sides that have been, quite frankly, flouting the embargo. What's interesting as well is that, the recent Turkish agreement with Tripoli has also meant that that they are also proposing to send arms and to provide assistance, which again is being criticized on the other side by the Egyptians, for example. And you'll notice as well that I think in recent days we've had the Arab League, primarily at Egypt's instigation, to try and meet and to try and push for against this Turkish approach. They've asked for sort of calming down the whole situation here to reduce the tensions. But obviously this is a lot of rhetoric. And then on the European side, we also happen to have a Berlin conference, which is scheduled to take place in a couple of weeks' time. Based on what's been happening recently, it seems somewhat unlikely that it's going to result in any kind of significant improvement or change in the situation that's on the ground.
Well, Turkey seems to be on the right side in this conflict, given the fact that the GNA is the recognized government of Libya by the United Nations. Guys, stay with me. I'm also joined by Serkan Burgel, who's a contributing writer for TRT World Research Center. Mr. Burgel, thank you for being on the program. We're discussing the fact that the Turkish parliament has passed a resolution with reference to deployment of troops in Libya. We were also discussing the reasons for why that be so. But let's first begin with the important opposition parties in Turkey that have opposed this vote. Why is that?
Most of the reason for that could be opposition simply to Erdogan. I don't think that the majority of the Turkish political spectrum is actually against the potential to deploy troops in Libya. Obviously, if troops do go, that's an escalation of the situation, and there may be even more opposition at home to go on a foreign adventure of some sort. But I do think that Turkish society and Turkish parties, by and large, do support this potential for intervention and to support the GNA, the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. So I think part of the explanation for opposition is perhaps just to say, or to keep rein of the situation and to make sure that there's no needless escalation without good reason or due reason.
Okay, now that's a very interesting, comment, because usually, even when there is political opposition on some of the major, issues of national security, there's generally, not always, but there's generally a bipartisan or a non-partisan consensus, political consensus. But when you say that it's largely opposition to Erdogan per se, are you saying that the opposition parties have decided that while there are national security reasons for Turkey to take this, step, they are more concerned about their opposition to Erdogan than that? Have I got that right? Was that the sense that you tried to convey?
And there is some truth to that, but I think that when you have a national security issue, which this Libya conflict also entails the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean and the boundary delimitations that are going on there, it's kind of hard not to resist supporting the UN-recognized government in Libya. So we, in essence, do want to support that government for a number of reasons. So I think that it's quite a convincing case in the Turkish public especially but also by and large with I think it was a 364 vote for and 100 and so vote against Turkish parliamentary ratification of the agreement. So there is unity to a large extent.
Okay, so if and when this deployment happens, because obviously Parliament now can decide, has given the government the right to decide the scope and the timing and the rest of it, what kind of deployment do you think we're looking at?
I don't think we will see large-scale troop deployment in the near future. A lot of that depends on how the situation unfolds in Libya itself. So it's not deterministic. Some people say that the Turkish intervention or Turkish support for the GNA is going to escalate the conflict, but that presupposes or assumes that there's been no conflict there in the first place. Turkey's responding to Haftar's offensive, and Haftar has been on the offensive multiple times over the last years, which has really thrown the Berlin process and the various other UN-backed efforts to kind of bring these two governments together or bring some sort of semblance to Libya since the fall of Gaddafi. So I think the chronology matters. Turkey's responding in this case, but it's going to taper its response. There's so many actors, as my colleague also said earlier. There's Russia, there's UAE, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different interests going on in the region. That will be a factor that tapers Turkey's response. And Turkey, I don't think, is in the appetite for a large-scale military intervention. But I think that there will be, say, for example, military advisors or weapons support, ammunition support, and it's going to be done officially. So there's been a lot of unofficial support for Haftar on behalf of even France, the Wagner mercenaries of Russia, the Sudanese mercenaries that we all know of. So I think this is a good move by Turkey to officially ratify and also taper any potential deployment depending on the situation in the ground.
Okay, let me go back to Guy here. Guy, let's talk about the Russian mercenaries factor here, which Mark was talking about. Give us a sense of how that's playing out and whether these mercenaries have the backing of Kremlin or they're, on their own.
Well, yes, thank you. So what we know about them primarily is that it's a few hundred people associated with the Wagner Group, which is supposedly an independent private company, but it has some connections, or its owners, its CEOs have some connection with the Kremlin. So it's sort of a somewhat blurry relationship between sort of the government and these people on the ground. Now, they're not many in number, but they've grown a little bit over the last few months, and from what we can tell is, they have been able to sort of provide a bit of a push towards Haftar's offensive, which has now reached, as I understand, sort of the outskirts of Tripoli. And this has meant that for the first time in about 9 months, Haftar's advance seems to have sort of destabilized the government in Tripoli itself. Now, that doesn't mean that the government itself is going to fall, but it certainly is in a situation where a much more precarious one than it was when Haftar first started this latest advance. And certainly there's a sense that sort of the Russians have, been quite influential in that regard. Now, beyond that, they've also supplied a number of sort of arms to Haftar, which has been used. But this is sort of, I guess, the most significant terms of sort of, direct boots on the ground. And it also follows to some extent the same approach that the Russians have taken in Syria back in 2015. That was primarily through sort of the use of sort of private contractors rather than sort of official Russian troops.
Yeah, well, in Syria, it makes sense because one can essentially look at the Russian stakes kind of, it's more overt. But in this particular case, I'm just trying to get my head around why Kremlin would be interested in supporting a rival group when the United Nations already has recognized a particular government. How would you decipher that?
Yeah, but it's also worth bearing in mind that the authority of the Tripoli government is very much limited to the city itself. It's not really managed to make as much advances in the rest of the country, which I suppose is partly the reason for the emergence of other actors in Libya. It's been very difficult for it to be able to sort of extend its legitimacy. Now, the Russians obviously have been sort of taking advantage of, or trying to at least use the case of Syria to leverage itself and to take advantage of sort of the instability that's been happening across the region as a whole. So Libya is not the only case where we've seen instances of Russian efforts to try and advance itself. Similarly, we've seen cases in Algeria in the last year, as well as in Sudan. And those are places where there is a certain degree of instability at the moment, which Russians are trying to exploit.
So you're saying that Russia is using these private military contractors or organizations, or call them what you will, in order to have some kind of toehold in these conflict situations?
Yeah, that would seem to be the case.
Okay. That would seem to be the case. As Guy Burton speaking with us. Thank you so much. Let me, before I wrap up the segment, go back to Mr. Burgel here. Mr. Burgel, how do you look at this Russian factor? Because, one of the panelists talked about it, and then I just spoke with Guy Burton about this. And of course, Turkey and Russia has had sort of ups and downs in Syria, but currently they have good relations. Turkey has got the S-400s from Russia. So how do you look at that?
I think Russia, as Mr. Churchill once said, is quite a mystery wrapped in enigma. So some people have said that Russia is wanting to be involved in Libya vis-a-vis Turkey in order to perhaps gain concessions for the situation in Idlib, in northwestern Syria. Some people say that it wants to be relevant on the international stage again, perhaps ask for concessions elsewhere. Maybe it wants to be a part of the Berlin process as well. So I think Russia is perhaps a kind of tough nut to crack in this situation. But yes, they have sort of, as my colleague has said, used their Wagner mercenaries instead of their state apparatus. So that could be, for example, a way for them to influence the situation, but not directly.
Okay, one final question and quick response. What are you expecting from the Berlin process, the meeting?
I mean, I'm really hoping that the sides come to an agreement before further military intervention or foreign intervention happens. We don't want that. We don't want this to be a proxy war. We don't want this to be sort of a conflict between Turkey or Greece. We need the EU and NATO to get more involved as well. I mean, they've been very quick to get rid of Gaddafi and not very keen on getting involved afterwards.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Serkan Burgel speaking with us about the situation in Libya and the possible Turkish deployment there. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Indian-occupied and annexed Kashmir. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In a latest incident of violence, Indian forces killed 3 young men in Rajouri district of occupied Kashmir. The civilians were targeted during a cordon and search operation in Nowshera area of the district. The Kashmir lockdown continues since August 5th, when Modi's government annexed the occupied state and downgraded its status. A recent article by Reuters reveals that the lockdown has cost Kashmir's economy more than $2.4 billion. The head of the Kashmir's Chamber of Commerce and Industry has warned that, and I quote, "This crisis will further intensify in 2020, unquote. India's shutdown of the internet in Kashmir has literally resulted in en masse disappearance of Kashmiri users from the popular and important messaging platform WhatsApp because of its policy on inactive accounts. A recent New York Times article notes that India tops the world by far in the number of internet shutdowns imposed by local, state, and national governments. Another subsequent editorial by the Washington Post asked, and I quote, "How long a country that follows this sinister path can truly be called a democracy at all," unquote. Is Kashmir becoming a forgotten story? For the latest, let's go to our panel, where we are joined by Ambassador Arif Kamal in Islamabad and Mr. Babu Singh, who is a former minister. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Ambassador Kamal. Ambassador Kamal, what's the latest? Is it now a forgotten story in the sense that there's so much happening in Syria and Libya now? Earlier today, the Americans killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds force in Iran. So there's a lot that's going on, and it seems to me that Kashmir is kind of, on the back burner once again. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think so. It seems that the rise of fascism in South Asia has not been without the images. It carries very tall images, and it is a continuing process. We know of the discriminatory laws enacted in India, that has also brought into sharper focus the sovereign India's real face. So the Kashmir situation, though not directly linked up with the Indian fascist within the domestic arena, it remains in the focal point. And if as we know that the killing of youth in Nushaira area, which is at the periphery of the valley, by itself explains that we are not any closer to normalcy. In fact, 150 days of lockdown have not precipitated into any change, any material change in the behavior patterns of the people in the valley.
Okay. Let me go to Mr. Babu Singh here. Mr. Singh, after the 5th August decision, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came on television and made a long speech trying to justify why his government had done what it had done, and also made a number of promises in terms of economic and social uplift in occupied Kashmir. But nothing has really happened. Not only that the people still remain locked up, the Indian government is trying to get second and third string leaders to somehow create some kind of political force that could upstage PDP and NC and other parties, including the Congress. What exactly is the game plan here? Because is there going to be a lockdown indefinitely, or is the lockdown still there because the government thinks that once they remove this, that people will take to the streets? What exactly is the policy here?
The Modi-led government on August 5, when they nullified the special status under Article 370 and Article 35A, they claimed, and when they degraded Jammu Kashmir state, the more than 100 years state, they degraded into a union territory and they divided into two union territories. They claimed that we have corrected a historical blunder. But according to me, they have not corrected the historical blunder, but in fact, they have committed a monumental blunder. It was a brutal mishandling with a very sensitive Jammu Kashmir state. After partition since 1947, it was the outcome of communal partition. Jammu Kashmir was the legacy of 1947 communal partition. In fact, Jammu Kashmir state is an unsettled, a trilateral political dispute. But unfortunately, from the all side, it always mishandled. They have not correctly, according to the basic nature of Jammu Kashmir political dispute, they never responded positively. Now, more than 5 months, there is a lockdown. The thousands of youths, they have arrested. Political leaders are arrested. 3 chief ministers, they are still under arrested. Even they were the partner. They were the partner of NDA and the Bharatiya Janata Party. They have not spared them. The matter is very clear. This depicts and this manifests their design. They have taken these actions. They have made a Jammu Kashmir state as a tool, a political tool to achieve the political power, to achieve their ultimate goal, the ultimate goal of to transform a secular and pluralistic India into a fascist Hindu state. This is their design. This is the part and parcels. This is the part and parcel. The Jammu Kashmir state,
Singh,
according to them, this is their.
Mr. Singh, there are Hindus. There are lots of Hindus who feel, inclusive towards other religions. So there's got to be a difference between the Hindu and the Hindutva. It seems to me that the BJP government, which is under the heavy influence of RSS, is essentially now a Hindutva government. Would you agree with me?
Definitely, it's 100%. It's not a BJP government. It is a totally, according to me, it is a totally RSS government. There is only the mosque of BJP, but the entire BJP is a political wing of RSS. So entire BJP from top to bottom, the RSS, the Nagpur captured the BJP, and now this is not BJP. This is in the real sense, this is the RSS. Now they feel that this is the right time to implement the agenda of 1925, the agenda of to transform a pluralistic India into a fascist Hindu nationalist state.
So, Mr. Singh, another thing that we have seen with the BJP is that whoever speaks about this is essentially branded as a traitor or a Pakistani agent. Now, clearly, you feel you are a proud, a Kashmiri, and I'm sure that if someone in India were to call you unpatriotic, that would anger you a lot. But this is the kind of rhetoric that is being used by this BJP RSS government.
This is quite nonsense, and I strongly condemn on behalf of my party, Global Party. I strongly condemn this. This is the manifestation of their fascist style of functioning and fascist methodology. They treat whosoever oppose them, whosoever oppose their policies, whosoever oppose their communal designs, they denigrate them. They are traitors. They are anti-national. But now, the people of India, all the identities of India, they understood the reality. And collectively, they are giving the answer to the BJP.
Okay, stay with me, Mr. Singh. Let me back to Ambassador Kamal here. Ambassador Kamal, Mr. Babu Singh is obviously very right in what he has expressed. Give me a sense of what more can the Kashmiris and the government of Pakistan do to keep this very important issue, which is important from a legal perspective, from the perspective of an unfinished agenda, from the perspective of human rights, and from other moral and other perspectives. How can we do that?
Well, Islamabad has been quite active in pursuing the human rights abuse track, and for that, I think the international observers, the way they look at the scenario unfolding in the Indian side of Kashmir, that has helped the endeavor that Islamabad is trying to make. On the political standing of what is now seen as fragmentation of the erstwhile state, I think there is not much that has been done to date, and it's just the question of how the interests collide. The international community, the major stakeholders don't want to say much that much cause annoyance to their big blot on the Indian land mass, where they find many consumers of their products. And therefore, I think there has not been a very monumental effort that has moved ahead. But I think that's not a cause of alarm because the Kashmiris think that they are a potent force in their own right. And if 150 days are any judge of the situation, for any opportunity to assess inner Kashmir dynamics, I think there are three elements that must be kept in view, and there's no way for me or anybody else to put them on the back track. First of all, is that both the so-called mainstream and the so-called separatists remain under the detention. It's first time in history that it has happened in 70 years. And this goes on. And whosoever are seen as voices of dissent from PDP or from other, don't attract any attention. There's no resonance of what they want to negotiate with Delhi. And it's also outweighed by the fact that only day before yesterday, Iltija, the daughter of
Mahbooba
Mufti was taken into custody in Srinagar. The second thing which I feel is very significant from the standpoint of inner Kashmir. When I say Kashmir, I mean erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. The inner Kashmir dynamics. There had been some street manifestations of the abrogation of 3.5a in Ladakh.
Yes.
And when I say Ladakh, I mean in Leh, not necessarily in Kargil. When you continue a clampdown for that long, and you find people coming in and asking and offering price for their land, and to generating fears that might be tested elsewhere in the world, say amongst the Uyghurs of Western China, for example. There is an inflow of the ethnic groups from outside in one go, all of a sudden causing commotions. So I think these, and again the realization amongst the Dogras, that's very much articulated. I don't want to put names on the voice net, but pundits, say Natasha Cole, for example, in the West is a professor and she is a pandita. So she is what you call is the vanguard of the Kashmiriyat today.
Correct.
So I'm trying to say is that Kashmiri factor is in play, though sometimes the silence speaks more loudly than the
Absolutely.
words.
Absolutely. That's a very Pinterest statement, Ambassador. Thank you so much. Ambassador Arif Kamal speaking with us. Mr. Babu Singh, thank you to you also. This is all for this week from Indus Special. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.